Good
Recording in
afternoon
progress.
or good morning, depending on your time zone. Welcome to our webinar today, Federal Policy Update on Child and Youth Homelessness. My name is Barbara Duffield, and I am the Executive Director of Schoolhouse Connection. Just a little bit of housekeeping as we get started today. On the next slide, we want to let you know, just as a reminder, that this webinar will last 1 hour. We're going to ask for your help today and ask you to please type any questions that you have into the questions and answer panel rather than the chat. That'll really help us out. We do expect probably close to 1,000 people signed up or participants today. We had 1,800 people sign up for today's webinar. So that will help us keep track. Our team will try to answer the questions as they come up, and we do aim to have time at the end of the webinar for questions too. This is being recorded, so you will get the slides and you will get a link to the recording and an evaluation afterwards. But we will also be dropping a link to the slides as well as a handy one-page summary of the links throughout today's session. We also want to let you know there's a certificate being issued, and we encourage you to sign up for our community on Slack to keep the conversation going. For those of you for whom this is your first Schoolhouse Connection webinar, we're a national nonprofit organization committed to ending homelessness or to overcoming homelessness through early care and education. We work the full continuum of learning from prenatal through post-secondary. We do policy advocacy at the state level and at the federal level. Most of our team is engaged in what we call practical assistance, that hands-on assistance to communities across the country to help them identify and support children, youth, and families who are experiencing homelessness. And we are also very proud to have a youth leadership and scholarship program where we are directly supporting young people to and through higher education. Today, we are very pleased to present this webinar jointly with our close partner at the National Network for Youth. Just as homelessness impacts all areas of a child or youth's life, it also cuts across many policy areas. So for us to respond effectively, we need to stay informed and we would need to work across sectors. So today, we present a united front to share a range of developments that may not impact your agency directly, but certainly will directly impact the children, youth, and families that you serve. And I'm very happy to introduce my friend and my colleague, Darla Bardine.
Thank you so much, Barbara. We are indeed incredibly proud to partner with Schoolhouse Connection. And like Barbara said, my name's Darla Bardine. I'm Executive Director of the National Network for Youth. For those of you who may not be familiar with our work, we partner with young people who've experienced homelessness and community-based service providers across the country to put forth effective solutions to prevent youth and young adult and young family homelessness, as well as human trafficking. We work directly in communities and advance community-based solutions. We also work at the federal level, and we're excited to be here. And with that, I will kick it back to Barbara. Thanks.
Darla. So here's what we have on tap today. We know that there is a lot happening and we have a lot to share. We are going to talk about executive orders, executive actions, and congressional actions as well. We know, again, there's a lot. We have quite a information-packed webinar for you today. So there's a lot happening, and we also know that it's changing fast. And by the time we finish this webinar, there may be something new. We will do our very best to explain terms and and again, you'll have the slides, you'll have the recording. So if there's a policy area that's new to you, just know that you have that. We'll also share a little bit about what we know to be effective in this current environment in terms of engaging policymakers and shaping policy. So we're going to dive right in the next section, really talking about executive orders and executive actions. On the next slide, the National Network for Youth has created a handy overview to just sort of explain again the checks and balances of executive orders. So you can see what an executive order is. This is, of course, providing instructions to government agencies on how to implement and enforce policy directions. But there are checks and balances. There are supposed to be checks and balances with the other government branches. So, for example, judiciary and in Congress. So we are going to talk about, in this webinar, the executive branch and the congressional branch, even though we're all watching what's happening in the courts and know that some of the brakes on current executive actions are going to be in the courts. Moving right along, the first piece we want to talk about is the executive order that was signed last week that directs the Secretary of Education to begin to take steps to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. There's another part to that executive order that reiterates the existing executive order against using federal funds for DEI initiatives. But the focus of the order and most of our attention is really focused on this beginning to take steps to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education. And as you can see, we have a link there to an FAQ that we put out about this last week. What I'd like to do is break down the executive order in 3 of its component parts. So on the next slide, again, it says to the maximum extent appropriate and permitted by law. So the first thing to point out is that there are certain things that are not permitted by law, like, for example, just getting rid of a federal agency. Really, only Congress can completely eliminate the Department of Education. 60 votes would be needed in the United States. But the other thing that's important about this is permitted by law. So many federal education programs, most of them actually are grounded in federal statute. The executive orders do not and cannot supersede or change federal laws. So the McKinney-Vento Act and many other education protections were not altered by this executive order. They remain in place. Next slide will share what exactly does federal education, what does the law actually say about the U.S. Department of Education's responsibilities with respect to children and youth who are homeless? Well, fortunately, federal law does spell out what the U.S. Department of Education has to do for children and youth who are homeless. Everything from reviewing state plans, administering the grants, providing support and TA, both upon request by states, but also where documented barriers exist. And there are other responsibilities that are clearly spelled out in the statute, the evaluation, the technical assistance, and publishing guidelines. So fortunately, again, the law spells out what the U.S. Department of Education has to do. The next piece of the executive order talks about returning authority for education to states and to local communities. So let's talk about that for a second. First of all, it's a little bit of a false flag in the sense that the federal government cannot and does not dictate curricula and other core education functions. Those are already matters for state and local government. When we look at this issue of returning education to states and localities for students who are experiencing homelessness, important to keep in mind that prior to federal law, homeless students couldn't even enroll in school because of state or local enrollment requirements, lack of transportation, not having liaisons in place to identify them. So there's a reason why we have a federal law to remove those barriers for students who are experiencing homelessness. We also know that it's really only a few states who have a comprehensive independent state law that doesn't reference McKinney-Vento with things like enrollment or transportation. So all states have revised their code, but most of them refer to the McKinney-Vento Act. So they're not sort of just their own state law mimicking McKinney-Vento. And only 3 states really provide a dedicated state line item for homeless students, not just transportation, but a state line item. So the bottom line is that for students who are experiencing homelessness, returning authority to the states is essentially relegating homeless students back to the streets, back to shelters, and away from the safety and stability of school. And there's the siren on Connecticut Avenue that is just emphasizing my point. The third piece to talk about here with the executive order is that it says, while ensuring the effective and uninterrupted delivery of services, programs, and benefits on which Americans rely. So all of the steps towards dismantling are supposed to be taking place while there are uninterrupted service and delivery of programs. And yet that we know that 1 week before the executive order, the Department of Education fired 1,300 employees, 1/3 of its workforce, which together with early retirements is half of the agency's staff. Most of the staff that were fired were in the Office of Civil Rights, Federal Student Aid, and the Office of General Counsel. We do know already that at least 42 federal student aid workers were called back because of problems with the FAFSA that occurred after that firing. And lastly, we know that the Institute for Educational Sciences, which includes the National Center for the Education Statistics, almost entirely eliminated. So this is really the backbone of what we know about assessments and data, the nation's report card on students, and also things like determining how much Title I money goes out based on census. So a great loss there as well. On the next slide, we do have some good news, and that is that at the current time, the federal homeless education staff were retained at the Department of Education. They have not been let go. They are there. The other piece of good news is that the National Homeless Education Technical Assistance Center, the National Center for Homeless Education, their contract remains in place. It has not been canceled. So again, we hang on to the law, we hang on to the good news in this time, a very troubling time. Moving on, what's happened since March 20th, since this executive order has been signed? Well, first of all, there have been 2 lawsuits that have been filed, one by the Education Law Center and another lawsuit by Democracy Forward. So we'll watch those lawsuits proceed. But also, almost the very next day, the president announced that special education, Individuals with Disability Education Act programs, school nutritions, and would move to the Department of Health and Human Services, and that student loans would move to the Small Business Administration. That was the same day that the Small Business Administration announced a 40% reduction in its staff. So it's unclear what is going to actually happen in the immediate with respect to those programs actually moving. There will likely be lawsuits. Again, the statute is cleared, special education and other laws about which agency administers it. But we do expect, and TJ will talk about this later, that we're going to see some of this play out in the fiscal year 2026 budget. On the next slide, just to share again, so what happens next? So one thing is litigation. Another thing is what Congress will do. So far in this Congress, there's been one bill introduced, H.R. 899 in the House, that would completely eliminate the Department of Education. It doesn't move programs around. It just essentially eliminates the Department of Education. Last session of Congress, there was a Senate bill introduced that did move some programs around. It did move, for example, student aid to the Treasury Department. It did move special education to HHS. But mostly what it did is repeal, and it repeal a lot of programs. So it repealed McKinney-Vento. It repealed Title I Part A. It repealed preschool programs. So that has not been reintroduced in this session of Congress. But on the same day that the executive order was issued, the Senator Cassidy, who is the chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, said that he would introduce legislation to accomplish the president's goal. So we do expect that. We do need to be ready to oppose any legislation that would repeal McKinney-Vento. Important to note that Senator Cassidy is in a tight reelection race in 2 years. So part of it we do think also is tied up in that. On the next slide, again, sort of like what can we do right now? Well, TJ is going to get into more detail, as will Darla later on, about what we know to be effective in this current climate, but we still need to act now. So we have an email template available. And again, you'll get the links to urge your member of Congress to oppose any legislation that would either repeal or defend McKinney-Vento and Title I. We know that more than emails are needed. And again, we'll get into that a little bit later on in the session. We do want to emphasize there's other related things that are happening as a result of the executive order, and a move for governors to request to block grant their elementary and secondary education funds. There are certain waivers in federal law that would allow the secretary to do that for some parts of some elementary and secondary education programs. McKinney-Vento is not one of them, however. So we have seen at least one state try to wrap McKinney-Vento into it. McKinney-Vento actually is its own law. It is not part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which means none of the waiver authority actually applies to it. So if you're working at a state agency, very important to lift that up. We have a link there to a great ESEA waivers if that's of relevance to you. But even if you could block grant, it's not a good idea for vulnerable students. We know specifically for students who are experiencing homelessness that if there isn't specific language targeting funds to them, they will not be served. We saw that in the pandemic with the first few pandemic relief programs where you could use funds for students experiencing homelessness, but very few states and school districts actually did. So again, block grants are something we're going to need to be paying close attention to so that we keep McKinney-Vento protections and we keep the targeted funding. On the next slide, again, just to put a pin in it, really emphasize that despite the chaos, despite the destructive actions, at this moment, the early care and education protections for children, youth, and families who are homeless are still in place. It's our job. These are important guardrails, but they're only as good as our efforts to actually implement them and to fight for them. So again, this is what we ground ourselves on. The guardrails are there. We need to keep them there. The next slide. Again, this is repeat maybe for some of you. It's not just McKinney-Vento, right? There are many pieces of federal policy that protect children and youth who are homeless. McKinney-Vento, Title I, IDEA. We know that 1 in 5 homeless students also has a disability. FERPA, Pilar versus Doe, Head Start. So really to keep that in mind. On the next slide, And again, I know I'm going fast, but like I said, we have a lot to cover today. Some helpful resources for you. One is a one-pager that just spells out what those protections are. The second one is a one-pager intended to help you explain and defend McKinney-Vento to a broad audience. And the third one is a fact sheet that you can also edit and include your own resources. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darla to talk about some other federal agencies.
Thank you, Barbara. So along the theme of providing updates around executive orders and actions, so earlier this month, there was an executive order issued that called to dismantle the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, or USICH, as well as 6 other federal agencies. The executive order did say, to the maximum extent consistent with applicable law. So USICH does exist in federal law. It was established by Congress in 1987 under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. So USICH does exist in 42 U.S. Code subchapter 2. So I do think, our assessment and the assessment of others is that making a full elimination of USICH without legislative action would be very legally challenging, because its existence is in federal law, and so it would take an act of Congress to eliminate USICH. Next slide. And like Barbara talked about with the U.S. Department of Education, through an order of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, all agencies are going through a process of downsizing or restructuring. Some have already started, like the U.S. Department of Education. All federal agencies had to submit plans to downsize or eliminate staff. And then they had 30 days to implement, to notify the plan, and then 30 days to actually lay off. So that is in process. Also, across federal agencies, agency staff have been directed to cease or highly limit external communications unless the content has been approved by a political appointee. And that content is presenting at a webinar, or speaking at a conference, replying to an email, sending out any type of public information, or even having a meeting, scheduling a Zoom meeting or an in-person meeting. And this delay is likely to continue because there haven't been that many political appointees put in place yet, and not at the level of the political appointees that usually work on our program. So there have been quite a few secretaries that have been put in place, but we're most often working with, assistant secretaries or commissioners within the bigger federal agencies. So our big takeaway here is to expect continued delays in communication from agency staff. Next slide. So we'll start with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So $65 million in HUD training and technical assistance contracts have been terminated. That money hasn't been redistributed anywhere within HUD. Our understanding is that it's going under the savings of, federal waste that DOGE is tracking, and that the reason for those cancellation was basically, DEI is the reason that was given. For the Youth Homeless Demonstration Program grant, there was a NOFO released last year, but the deadline to submit it was this year. That NOFO was pulled from HUD's website. Our understanding is that HUD will be rewriting and reposting that NOFO, or at least that is our hope. For the Youth Homeless System Improvement Grants, or YISI grants, most YISI grants grantees had signed contracts earlier this year. And to our knowledge, HUD personnel have not yet contacted YISI grantees and told them they need to modify their contracts or budgets. When they do, reply and respond. But our kind of advice is to keep operating under the contracts that you have as they're written, and then make adjustments as needed or as is requested. We do know that some YISI training and technical assistance providers have lost their contracts, but others have maintained their contracts. And so what they've done is they've reorganized how the training and technical assistance is taking place for YSSI grantees. And so instead of individualized communities in person, it's cohort-based and virtual. So YSSI grantees should still be getting the support they need to implement their contract requirements. And so our kind of bottom line in general is to continue to follow the requirements of your current contract unless you are told otherwise by HUD staff. Next slide. Also continuing with HUD updates. So the fiscal year 2024 COC contracts have not yet been signed and funds have not yet been obligated. March 4th was the statutory deadline. March 14th, there was a lot of activity around the HUD contract. So a new HUD contract was released. Then a court issued a nationwide injunction. An injunction is basically a hold on implementing for 3 parts of the diversity, equity, and inclusion executive order. Then later in the evening on March 14th, HUD rescinded the contracts, saying they're working to revise the grant agreements to be consistent with federal law and applicable court orders. We have yet to see a new updated HUD contract, though I see in chat somebody did receive it, email it to us, Trinity, or myself. We can share email in chat because we'd love to compare and contrast what is different, because I think it will be pretty instructive as to how they're actually being responsive to the court orders that are coming down in response to the executive orders. If your contract is overdue or has been overdue, we know that some continuums of care have been providing housing and services all year, all month, for 2 months without any reimbursement. So please, members of Congress want to know what the impact of these funding delays have been on your programs, on your employees, on the people that you're serving, on your community. And so document it, specific stories, specific impact, definitely. Sorry, next slide. So also, this just happened, but just so everybody knows, so 2 days ago, HUD signed a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Homeland Security entitled American Housing Programs for American Citizens. That MOU says that HUD and DHS, Department of Homeland Security, will begin to coordinate efforts and develop measures to ensure that only American citizens are housed by HUD-funded programs. This just happened, so we do not know how eligibility will be determined if individuals don't have access to vital documents, including an ID, a birth certificate, a social security card. We don't know how it will impact mixed status families. We don't know how non-citizens will be with protected statuses will be impacted, and on and on. We do not know. But this is limited to this is HUD funded housing. It's limited to HUD funded housing, not any other federal agency, to our understanding at this time. Now moving to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, for those of you who get Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funding, we have heard that the Administration on Children and Families at HHS is working on the new NOFO that should be released this summer. Also, on March 24th, so just a couple of days ago, the Administration on Children and Families sent a letter to state administrators of TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, reminding them that it is prohibited to provide benefits to illegal aliens, and that this action is in line with the executive order ending taxpayer subsidizations of open borders. All these the MOU, the HUD MOU, this letter to TANF, all of these are hyperlinked and provided in the resource. So if you want to see, the details of what that says, those links are there for you to see. And next slide, I'm kicking it back to Barbara.
Thanks, Darla. So again, another executive order that was pretty recent from ACF to Head Start agencies Again, in this case, stating that any training or technical assistance or other expenditures can't promote or take part in DEI. We just want to remind everybody that the word homeless is in the statute, it's in the regulations. There are requirements that Head Start programs identify homeless children, remove barriers to their enrollment and participation. The Office of Head Start is actually required to provide technical assistance on homelessness. So just a reminder that those requirements are in place, just because, again, we've heard some confusion, people thinking that DEI applies to the word homeless. It doesn't. So just wanted to remind you. Next, back to, I think, Darla.
Thank you. So obviously there's a lot of other executive orders that are relevant that you're interested in. But we only have an hour, but we wanted to make sure you knew that there is a tracker. So Education Council does maintain a tracker, and it provides a summary. There is a focus on early care education as well as immigration and government. Also wanting to remind everybody again that executive orders do not supersede federal laws. They cannot change a federal law or a Supreme Court ruling or case law. Federal law is still the law of the land. Supreme Court case law over actions in orders very hold on implementing the executive order, when and how the administration is actually honoring those holds and injunctions is worth seeing and learning how that plays out and keeping you all updated. There is a resource linked here that is keeping track of all the different court actions, court filings, lawsuits against the administration. So you can look at that link and see which executive orders are temporarily enjoined, and it provides kind of more information and background. So it's a very helpful resource for those of you who are wanting to kind of keep track of what's going on in the courts. And again, just to put a fine point on it, we know there is a lot of uncertainty right now and rapidly changing information and news, and it can be really hard to know what's true, what, a lot of water cooler talk, people are saying things, is it true, is it not true, and it can be very overwhelming. And I know that as you're running programs, you're running organizations, it can be difficult to know, what are the best choices to make. But like I've said, federal law is still federal law. And in the face of uncertainty, the rights that young people have, the obligations that schools have and other providers to serve young people is still true. We do have a resource here that talks a little bit more just about the limitations of executive orders and the laws that are still laws, just like Schoolhouse Connection has a resource. We really encourage you to stay up to date around executive orders that could be impacting the services that you provide, the young people you serve, but also to stay up to date to know which ones have been temporarily enjoined, which ones, there's ongoing litigation around. We also know that as contracts or, federal contracts are sent out or other requirements, or you're being told to do this or that, it can be hard to know what to do and what your legal obligations are. And so for those of you who may need legal support or legal counsel, we do have a partnership with the National Homelessness Law Center. You can contact Katie, her email is there, and she will do her best to connect your organization to pro bono legal counsel. So we do want to make sure you're aware of that resource. And with that, I am handing it off to TJ.
Thanks, Darla. My name is TJ Lucas, and I'm the Senior Manager for Federal Policy at Schoolhouse Connection. In fact, before Schoolhouse Connection, I was a congressional staffer. I covered education and housing homelessness policy for Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia in a previous from 2015 to 2021. The first thing that I want to talk about on the next slide is what just happened in Congress. On March 14th, we finally had a continuing resolution for the rest of FY25 make its way to President Trump's desk. He signed it, which is in effect until September 30th, 2025. The federal fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th of any given year. So you may be wondering why we just finished FY25 in March of this year. And that is because we passed several small continuing resolutions that got us to this point. The continuing resolutions includes funding for most federal programs at their current levels, but it does leave some discretion for the administration to alter that funding level for federal programs. It is congressional leaders' expectations that the funding levels that were in FY24 are also the same funding levels in FY25 unless explicitly outlined in the FY25 continuing resolution. Now that the FY25 process is finalized, Congress will immediately turn their attention to FY26. And on the next slide, we'll talk about the two different budget processes that are happening simultaneously. So Congress is now beginning work on FY26, and this is the annual discretionary funding for programs that include the Education for Homeless Children and Youth programs, as well as the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act programs, housing, Head Start, and other programs that will impact the 2026-2027 school year. At the same time, Congress will also be working on a budget reconciliation package. And this is mandatory spending on entitlements like SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, student loans, as well as taxes. The easiest way to break it down is that Congress must pass a budget every year to keep the lights on, to keep the government funded, to keep programs running. And if they don't, there's no federal funding, the programs shut down. The reconciliation package is a unique budget process that will be talked about a little bit later, that is only being able to happen because of the current makeup of Congress and different dynamics that will be explained a little bit later in this webinar. And so this is kind of the wish list of Congress, what they want to happen, legislation that they think that they were elected to enact. On the next slide, FY26 has already begun in earnest. Typically, the usual kickoff is the president's budget, which usually comes out earlier in the year. We are expecting it in May of this year, just given that it is a new president. And the one thing that we want to mention with the president's budget is that it is just a proposal. It is not the final budget that Congress will enact. The president will put in this administration's priorities in their budget proposal to Congress. No Congress has ever adopted a president's budget in whole. And given the recent executive order that Barbara talked about, we expect to see steep cuts, eliminations, or some sort of impact to the education portion of the president's budget. We could see that as soon as May. For committee action, the House Appropriations Committee Chairman Tom Cole has said that he wants to have all 12 appropriations bills through the House committee by the end of April. That is a very ambitious goal, and given that we don't have the president's budget yet, that could push his stated timeline back a little bit. And another factor, as I mentioned earlier, is that they're also doing reconciliation simultaneously. Reconciliation is the primary focus of Congress at this moment. They are working to finalize a package that can pass both the House and the Senate, and that is taking up time otherwise spent on doing the annual appropriations process. And on the next slide, we have an opportunity for you to take action. There is a bipartisan letter in the House that is being led by Representatives Danny Davis of Illinois, Don Bacon of Nebraska, and Jimmy Panetta of California. They are circulating a letter to their colleagues asking that their colleagues join them in supporting annual appropriations for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Funds and the Runaway and Homeless Children Youth Act programs. Specifically, $200 million for McKinney-Ventos, EHCY, and $304 million for RHYA programs. On the next slide, what we need from you is to reach out to your members of Congress and let them know that you would like their support on this letter. This is a letter that the representatives will be sending to the leaders of the Appropriations Committee to signify their priorities for the FY26 budget. This is happening simultaneously. This is happening right now, and we need your participation. We have an action alert that we will talk about right here on this next slide, but we currently have the letter. We have links to the letter. We have and talking points for both programs that we can provide you to help you tailor a personalized message to your members of Congress. The more outreach that you conduct to your members of Congress, the more members that we will likely get on board with this. And this, the reason it's so important to have members on the record stating their support for these programs is the more members that we get, the better off our chances of getting funding. We are asking for an increase over the FY24, FY25 level of $129 million, and more will be revealed on the FY25 process in the coming days. On the next slide, we have an illustration. You can take action in just 2 quick minutes. You can do it right from your phone right now or anytime. Remember that the link on the previous slide to take action, this is what it looks like. Just tap the link or scan the code and you'll hop into an action form already set up for you. You just enter your contact info, you'll see your legislators, your members of Congress, and a starter message that we have already put in for you. All you have to do is tailor the message from the impacts on your community and why you're hoping that they will sign on to this letter and submit it that way. On the next slide, I will pass it back over to Darla and Trinity.
Thanks, DJ. Hello, everyone. My name is Trinity Maddock, and I am the Senior Policy Associate at National Network for Youth. And I'm just going to go a little bit more into detail about budget reconciliation, which, as TJ explained, is a separate budgetary process from fiscal year 2026 appropriations, but is a process that's happening right now concurrently with FY26 appropriations and will have an impact on this fiscal year's appropriations as well as future years' appropriations. So as TJ mentioned, budget reconciliation is a special legislative process to more easily pass budget-related laws for mandatory spending, for revenue, so taxes, and the federal debt limit. So these changes to spending, revenue, and debt have to take place over a 10-year period, which is why reconciliation would have an impact now and on future appropriations. And the reason why it's easier to pass reconciliation bills is because they only require 51 votes in the Senate to pass, whereas most Senate bills require 60 votes. So when a party has a majority, so right now the Republican Party has 53 seats in the Senate, then they can take advantage of the budget reconciliation process without really needing support from the other party. So right now, the priorities for this budget reconciliation are to increase spending to strengthen border and immigration policies, to increase spending for specific defense initiatives that fall under mandatory spending, and then to enact or extend a pretty significant number of tax cuts. Now, of course, Budget 101, if you want to decrease your revenue and increase certain spending, it means you have to cut other spending. So a list of proposals came out a while back from the House Budget Committee, and there's been further talk about these programs since then, about taking those cuts from programs like Medicaid, like SNAP, like TANF, Social Security block grant, student loan repayment, and a number of others are included on that list. So that's kind of what's on the table right now with budget reconciliation and what they are deciding on. Now, I said this process is easier because it only requires 51 votes in the Senate instead of 60, but I don't want to imply that it's going to be a smooth and easy, seamless process. There are many hurdles for Congress to overcome before even getting to the part where they can write and pass final reconciliation bills. And the hurdle that they're working through right now is for the House and the Senate to agree on a budget resolution. So this is like a framework or a blueprint that will outline their targets for spending, revenue, debt limit changes. And right now, the House and Senate have different budget resolutions. So they need to agree on one before they can start writing reconciliation bills. Now, House and Senate leaders have a pretty ambitious target to agree on the one budget resolution by the week of April 7th. Probably unlikely that this will happen, especially since, as TJ mentioned, Representative Cole also wants to have appropriations bills done by the end of April. But that kind of long timeline that we're likely looking at for resolution and then reconciliation bills means that there is still time to let your representatives know that you oppose cuts to things like SNAP, like TANF, like all the important programs that the Social Security block grant funds, which includes housing and homeless assistance, child welfare, after school program, all these important programs. And as TJ mentioned, we're going to talk about some ways to advocate to your representatives towards the end. So we definitely touched on, some of the ways that this reconciliation process could negatively impact children, youth, and families. But just to reiterate, in order to enact these tax cuts to certain populations and to do the other things that the reconciliation seeks to achieve, that money has to come from somewhere. And the entitlement programs that I mentioned, as well as many others that you can see on that list that's linked in a few slides ago, they're on the chopping block right now. So when you're thinking about becoming involved in advocacy for budget reconciliation, just note that reconciliation is happening. So the ask there would not be to, stop the reconciliation process because it is moving forward. The ask is, don't take from children, youth, and families who depend on these federal programs in order to accommodate tax cuts or, this increased spending in other areas. You all already know that the funding for these really important programs is already stretched very thin. So as advocates, we just want to prevent even fewer resources from reaching those in need. So that's budget reconciliation. Again, a process the House and Senate Republicans are currently working through to change mandatory spending levels, to make tax cuts, and to potentially increase the federal debt limit. And all of this could come at a huge expense to children, youth, and families. So just something else to keep your eye on among the many other things that you're tracking right now, as another process that's happening concurrently with fiscal year 2026 appropriations. And back to TJ, who's going to review an expected timeline for all of these budget actions.
Thanks, Trinity. The next two slides are resources that we've put together for you to help kind of make sense of what is happening. Right now, in the month of March, in the last few days that we have left, we really need you to reach out to your members of Congress. I've been seeing a few comments in the chat about how their member may not be responsive to their outreach or that it may not matter. I encourage you to stay tuned for some effective strategies that we have, and then email me. I'd love to talk with you more specifically and strategize on how we can help you out there. but the action alert is happening right now. So I hope that everybody can take a couple minutes today and fill that out. Next month, what we expected to happen was the president's budget would be released, but we got an email literally 30 minutes before this presentation letting us know that it is now expected in May. Also in April, the budget reconciliation votes in the House and Senate trying to sync up will happen, and the potentiality for some Appropriations Committee hearings are also very likely. In May, you will see further votes on reconciliation, with Speaker Johnson saying that he would like to have something completed by the end of May, Memorial Day weekend, and then the FY26 process will continue into the summer. On the next slide, if you need help just kind of figuring out where things stand or what's the latest breaking information, please feel free to check out our links here. We have a live tracking of all of the actions that are happening, a federal policy page, and N4Y's latest blog posts. And I will kick it over to Barbara for effective strategies.
Thank you very much. So now the question is, what do we do? On the next slide, and the next couple slides, we're going to talk about particularly in this environment, some of the things that we've done before, we need to do a little bit differently, we need to do more of. One thing we know for sure is that the wonky stuff that we do in DC, that's not actually where these battles are going to be won or lost. It's going to be in local communities, local data, stories, voices, and engagement. But given the fact that literally every sector is on fire right now, it's not just education, early care, homelessness, housing, it's everywhere. Given the intense level of agitation that we're seeing across all issues, we do need to find ways to kind of cut through the noise and to be engaged as strategically as possible. So a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, on the next slide, just to make very clear that you don't need to be a policy wonk. All these things about reconciliation and the processes, like we do that, we're telling you so you have a sense of what's going on, but you don't need to know that to engage your policymakers and their staff. Speak to what you do, speak to what you know, speak to what's on your mind and what's in your heart. Because above all right now, speak in whatever way you can, because silence is the single greatest threat to our children, youth, and families. Next slide, share a little bit about what do members of Congress, what do they need to know? When we go in, when you meet with them, what do they want to know? Well, first of all, they want to know how many children and youth experiencing homelessness are homeless in your community or have been identified. So data is a great place to start. Who's been identified, who you served, all of those pieces. What does your program or agency actually do to assist them? They need to know your role in this. If you get federal funding, how do you use it? I can't tell you how many times we've been in meetings and they don't know, for example, with McKinney-Vento, what the funds are used for. So explaining how the funds are used. What are those outcomes that you see federal funding, just like MAP, to unemployment, to future homelessness. These are the pieces to really have in mind as you engage. I'm going to turn it over now to Darla, who can talk about some specific ways.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. So, as the saying goes, all politics are local. In-district advocacy is a really effective tool because like Barbara said, all of us, we're here in the DC area meeting with folks in Washington, DC, but we are not constituents of all states and all representatives districts. And so it's really a critical time that you connect directly with your U.S. representatives, your U.S. senators, when they're back in their home state, back in their home district. And you can provide real-world policy content as to the impact on their constituents to the policy debates that are happening in Washington, D.C. And when they have that connection, they're much more likely to take meaningful action to protect our programs, to advocate for our programs with other members of Congress. So one of the ways you can take action is meeting directly with your legislators and their staff when they're at their local offices. So all U.S. representatives have offices within their state, within their district. This helps to build personal relationships with both your representatives and their staff. And you're much more likely to get FaceTime with your actual senator or your actual U.S. representative in their home district or state. You can also host a site visit To show the impact of your program or your services. You can invite them to your school, to your drop-in center, to your shelter, whatever program it is that you're providing. It's really impactful to see programs in action, to see the computer lab, to see the laundry room, to see the drop-in center, to really see exactly the impact that you're having on young people, on children, on families in their community who need support. Invite your representatives, but also invite their staff to come along as well. And next slide. So these are some weeks coming up where your senators and your U.S. representatives will be back in their home states or districts. So we really encourage you to reach out now, reach out to the scheduler for your senators, reach out to the scheduler for your U.S. representative, and tell them that you're requesting a meeting or you want to invite them to a site visit during one of these weeks when they're back in their home state. And then we're going to have a tool that we're going to push out next month that provides kind of more resources about how to prepare for those site visits and meetings. But I'm sure many of you have experience and would do a great job. Also, if you're not sure who your legislators are, we do have a lookup tool that you can utilize, put in your address, and all your elected officials will come up. Next slide. So relationship mapping. So members of Congress, they are real people. They have spouses, children, friends, colleagues that they listen to that are influential to them. And so who do you know who's in your sphere of influence that may have a connection to that member of Congress or to their staff? What does that member of Congress care about? You can look at their website, you can look at their social media challenge, and you can see what are they concerned about, what are they talking about, what are their priorities, and how does that connect to or impact children, youth, and families experience homelessness? Do they care about mental health? Do they care about the child welfare system, education? Are they really concerned about the trafficking of children and youth? Do they care about the economy? That can be a way to make the connection to the issue, make it real for your elected officials. Do you know someone who knows someone in their circle? Someone that you know from church, from school, someone on your, nonprofits have boards of directors. They might have connection to the elected official or to a staff for the elected official. You could have a state representative or a city representative that has a connection to that senator, to that representative, maybe somebody you know at golf. So some examples from our experience at the National Network for Youth is we had a youth homelessness provider whose city council member could text the senator that had a relationship with the U.S. senator and so was willing to reach out and make the ask directly over text to the U.S. senator. We had a service provider who had a board member, a member of their board of directors that used to work for the U.S. representative, so they could make the connection there. We had another member organization who their senator's wife used to volunteer at their program. So you never know the connections that you have until you ask, until you reach out and ask if anybody has that connection. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to TJ.
Thanks, Darla. I always like to share the story of how I first got involved in this issue. I was working for my boss covering education and housing issues when it was flagged for us that there was an article in one of the newspapers in our state that had a headline of 10,000 children and youth in So that is one real life example of how local news can impact policy change. And if you have the ability to invite your newspaper or local media company to come visit and do a story or provide statistics and updates, if you are looking to do an op-ed or an editorial, we can help you with that. Feel free to let us know. My email will be on the screen here shortly in on the next slide, one of the most effective ways that you can use those local news stories is to get a meeting with your member of Congress. And the way that meetings work is that whether they're virtual or in person or on site, we can help you identify the right staffer. We can help you set up the meetings. We'll prepare you with some talking points and information. We have our data profiles that we certainly will have for you, and then we can accompany you to those meetings. And whatever you need, if there's any questions, comments, concerns about how to do this, please email me, tj@schoolhouseconnection.org, and we will certainly do our best to help you. On the next slide, these are two additional ways to communicate with your members of Congress, either through electronic letters or phone calls. Electronic letters are not a substitute for direct meetings. Meetings and visits are the most important, most effective way of communicating with your members of Congress and their staff. However, if you can get a large number, your family, your friends, going back to the relationship mapping, everybody that you golf with or play cards with or whoever, are sending in letters on important topics to them, your member of Congress is receiving these letters. They do receive those letters. And always customize it with personal information that can show the local or state impact. And on phone calls, that is for more urgent crises, when a vote is imminent or actually occurring. And make sure that you share your address so that they know that you are a part of, you are a constituent, and that you would like a response so that they can get back to you. And with that, I will pass it over to Barbara for questions.
Well, we have gone through quite a lot, and we still have 4 whole minutes left of this presentation. So we have been answering questions throughout, both in the chat and in the Q&A. We do have one question. Do you recommend that we send these letters requests for time from our organizations, that's 501c3, as individuals, or both? Again, 501c3 organizations are able to engage with their legislators and educate them. I think anytime you can put something on letterhead, it helps. So if you are working for a nonprofit organization, again, you'll want to clear it with your board of trustees or whoever, but that definitely helps. And certainly we know that our partners at the National Network for Youth and many of our other partners are engaging as organizations. But if you work for a school district or a state and you've been told, oh, I'm not allowed to do that, you always have the ability as an individual to weigh in, as a citizen to weigh in. Again, no one knows what you know. So even if it's not in your official role, you can do that. And I would say, really, it's both. We also have a question, and I think maybe this one might be for Darla. Does this new order mean that undocumented women can no longer receive WIC benefits? So this is the one that you talked about.
We haven't seen any specific guidance around WIC. The specific guidance we've seen is around SNAP. So there hasn't been a letter to WIC administrators yet. And the letters and guidance that has gone out have been as clear as mud, right? So there hasn't been a lot of specificity in terms of how anything is going to be implemented or any rollback. So we'll keep tracking and sharing updates and information as we learn them.
So again, the PowerPoint presentation, the recording will be emailed out to you. It will also be on the webinar section of the Schoolhouse Connection website. So you'll have it again for replay. We do intend to do these webinars as soon as we have kind of critical mass for things that we need to share. So you can expect to see more of these. We also ask for your help in filling out the evaluation. That helps us a lot. We know what was valuable to you. We know what you need more of, what you need less of. So I would urge you to fill out that evaluation. We're not going to go over our final slides. We have promotional things for both of our organizations, upcoming webinars that the National Network for Youth is doing, upcoming webinars for Schoolhouse Connection, but just know that you have all of that. We really appreciate your taking your time to be with us today. Please stay engaged. Please partner with us. And again, just thank you so much for all that you do.